At the heart of a revolution, there's always a revolutionary, and 2024's collapse of the Assad dynasty in Syria was no different. As rebel forces streamed into Damascus, as dancing and celebration broke out on city streets, as the dictator fled his nation in a panic and his forces collapsed behind him, Syria passed into the control of a new authority, the militant Islamic organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. Like the regime that toppled it, HTS is beholden to one man above all others, one single voice with the power to choose a path forward for the Syrian people, or perhaps a path leading back to ruin and despair. Meet Abu Mohammed al Golani, second emir of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the de facto leader of post-liberation Syria. He's a man with a complex past, one whose life has charted a winding course from resistance to jihad to governance to revolution and now to true power at the helm of a nation. He's controversial, he's unpredictable, his intent is unclear, and there is most certainly the blood of thousands on his hands. At once, he holds the potential within himself to be the expression of Syria's brightest possible future and to be the expression of a new nightmare in which Syria may not realize it's already been trapped. Today, on this special episode of WarFronts, this is Abu Mohammed al Golani, the jihadist, the revolutionary, the uncrowned king of Syria. The man who would eventually adopt the nom de guerre of al Golani was born Ahmed Hussein al-Sharaa on an unclear date in 1982. Born into a family of Syrians who had been displaced from their homes in the disputed Golan Heights in 1967, al-Sharaa was born in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. His father was an Arab nationalist, an ideological student of Gamal Abdel Nasser, one of the leaders of the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, and the broader movement toward a single Arab nation. He'd come to Saudi Arabia to use his training as an oil engineer, and he'd go on to publish works on economic development. Besides his father's ideological leanings, the young Ahmed al-Sharaa was born into a family with a revolutionary history. His great-grandfather, Mohammed Khalid al-Sharaa, was a major player in the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925, for which he'd been sentenced to death but never executed. The young Ahmed al-Sharaa's family was relatively well-off and were middle-class in Saudi Arabia, owing to his father's work in the oil sector. When little Ahmed was about 7 years old, his family moved back to Syria and were able to afford a home in the suburbs of Damascus called Beza, a home for the generally well-to-do of Syrian society. There, Ahmed would grow up through what was, according to all sources on his life, a relatively quiet and uneventful time on a personal level. After his rise to prominence inside Syria, biographers have interviewed his classmates and childhood neighbors, who typically describe him as having been withdrawn, sometimes painfully introverted, but smart and good-looking. According to some sources, the later years of his adolescence were marked by a romance with a girl from Syria's minority Alawite community, the same sect of Islam shared by the Assad family themselves. Neither Ahmed's family nor his sweethearts approved of the relationship, although the circumstances under which it ended remain unclear. According to his own statements later in life, including a particularly notable 2021 interview with the Frontline documentary series published by America's PBS, the young man got his first taste of radicalization in the year 2000 when he was about 18 or 19 years old. In that year, al-Sharaa had the dubious honor of living just one national border away from the Second Intifada, a major series of Palestinian uprisings that began that year against Israeli occupation. To hear his older self tell the story, the Intifada led a younger Ahmed to start considering whether he should defend a people like the Palestinians, who he described as, quote, oppressed by occupiers and invaders. Once he decided that he should do such a thing, he began to consider, in turn, the question of how he would go about doing it. For the next few years, Ahmed would watch the Intifada as it wore on, eventually with several thousand Palestinians killed by Israeli troops and civilians. He kept up his studies, started work on a medical degree, and remained close to his family and childhood community in Damascus. But during those years, a young mind already transfixed by the Second Intifada would witness another major world event that would force him to consider the far broader realities of the Middle East. That event would be 9/11, the September 2001 terror attack by al-Qaeda against the United States. In the wake of the attack, al-Sharaa, now in his early 20s, would consider traveling to become part of the anti-Western movement, something he ultimately did in 2003. Traveling to the Iraqi capital city of Baghdad by bus, al-Sharaa happened to arrive just a few weeks before the United States launched its ill-fated invasion, and as a result, he was on the ground floor of al-Qaeda's operations in the country once the invasion kicked off. The young terrorist's activities are somewhat hazy during this period, and no, there's no point shying away from the T-word here. What al-Sharaa and his organization were doing during that time was oh so very much terrorism. Some sources claim that the young man grew close to the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Mohammed al-Zawahiri, although he himself has disputed that claim, insisting that he was a mere foot soldier and never met the man. During these years, Ahmed al-Sharaa would adopt the name Abu Mohammed al Golani, with that adopted surname, Golani, referring to the Golan Heights, from which his family had been displaced so many years earlier. With the adoption of his new name, we'll be referring to Ahmed al-Sharaa as Abu Al Golani from this point forward. In 2006, after American and coalition forces had largely established control and shortly before the outbreak of the Iraqi civil war, al-Golani was one of many young al-Qaeda fighters swept up in the maw of American military intelligence. He'd be held for a time at the Abu Ghraib prison complex, though his detention there took place after the worst abuses of the US government had been exposed and ended, at least in that location. He'd travel through several other holding sites over the next several years, including the notorious Camp Bakr, a camp that's now known for having been a veritable breeding ground for jihadist extremism. His stint there would place Golani among a notorious selection of terrorist figures, including future Islamic State Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and Golani would remain a part of the US internment system from his capture in 2006 to his release in 2011. Again, however, al-Golani was the beneficiary of what would be considered, for a jihadist fighter himself, some auspicious timing. This time, al-Golani walked out of the US-run prisons of Iraq just as the Arab Spring made its way to Syria, and with a revolution already waiting for him, al-Golani made his way home. When al-Golani returned to Syria, he did it with marching orders provided by his al-Qaeda superiors. Golani was traveling with quite the repository of funds, a small handful of about half a dozen followers, and a mission to expand the organization's mission across the Iraqi-Syrian border. Al-Qaeda was reportedly quite happy to be rid of Golani for a mix of ideological and operational reasons, and perhaps it should have been no surprise to them that Golani would strike out on his own upon arrival. Once in Syria, Golani made contact with the same future Islamic State leader that we just mentioned, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was, at that time, leading a predecessor organization called the Islamic State of Iraq. His naming conventions were not exactly creative. Golani and Baghdadi struck a deal in which both Baghdadi's ISI organization and Golani's new al-Qaeda branch would be able to do their work peacefully side by side. Any troubles or disagreements between them would be sent up the chain to the leader of al-Qaeda, at that time Ayman al-Zawahiri. In addition to agreeing to his end of the bargain, Baghdadi came to Golani bearing gifts, men, weapons, and money to get Golani through what would be the lean years of his terrorist startup. Golani provided the group's name, the Support Front for the People of the Levant, shortened to the al-Nusra Front. Formally consolidated on the 23rd of January 2012, al-Nusra adopted the core objective of overthrowing Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad before establishing an Islamic State in Syria under the tenets of Sharia law. Quickly, the group accepted an influx of foreign fighters arriving to be part of what was metastasizing into an all-out civil war, and they proved especially attractive for fighters who'd picked up real combat experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. At the head of it all was Golani, a man who would rapidly become one of the most important jihadists of the entire Middle East. As the machine of their insurgency roared to life, the al-Nusra Front quickly began to draw global attention. They weren't like the other resistance groups fighting in Syria, even the other fundamentalist ones. They were disciplined, they were cunning, they were well organized, and they were highly effective in carrying out their mission, drawing even the grudging praise of Western media as the most effective fighting force in Syria before the group was a year old. By the end of 2012, al-Nusra had gathered between 6,000 and 10,000 fighters to its ranks, and they'd acquired a reputation within Syria, both for their ruthlessness in battle and their consistent willingness to be the tip of the spear of the nationwide resistance. But al-Nusra was notable in Syria for reasons that went well beyond the effectiveness of its fighters, and particularly, it was notable for its willingness to make liberal use of terror tactics, especially suicide bombings. Even before the group consolidated, one of its fighters carried out a Damascus bombing that killed 26 people, including 15 civilians and 11 police officers, with the organization taking credit not long after their official formation. They'd carry out additional suicide bombings in Damascus, they'd carry out and claim credit for mass executions, and they'd kill 48 and severely wound over 120 more in a car bombing in Aleppo. They'd overrun an air defense base and multiple army barracks. They'd lead large-scale attacks on various other regime bases and checkpoints, and when they killed surrendering Syrian soldiers en masse, they saw to it that video of the executions would circulate online. As of June 2013, a total of 70 suicide attacks had been recorded in Syria, 57 had been claimed by al-Nusra Front. But during these same months, Abu Al Golani's relationships with the Islamic State of Iraq, as well as al-Qaeda leadership, had begun to go sour. Although it would be a while before Golani ever publicly began to question the value of international jihad, his organization was very clearly focused on victory in Syria, and both his group's rhetoric and its actions evolved to match. As Golani started to accrue his successes in Syria, he drew suspicion from Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi that he might have been looking to strike out in a new direction, away from the broad jihadist objectives of caliphate at home and attacks on the West abroad. In a power play that would go down in history, in April of 2013, Baghdadi declared the formation of a new organization, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, better known today as ISIS, and when he did, he framed it as a merger with the al-Nusra Front into one organization under Baghdadi's sole authority. Golani and his inner circle, however, weren't having any of it, and in order to stay independent, Golani broke from the new ISIS organization, pledging loyalty directly to the international leader of al-Qaeda. With the support of the al-Qaeda organization, al-Nusra remains on the course that Golani had set for it, although not without attracting the ire of Baghdadi and his fighters. The ensuing conflict between ISIS and al-Nusra would last for the better part of a year, until al-Qaeda eventually disavowed ISIS and specified that al-Nusra was its sole active branch in Syria. The following year and a half were not a quiet time for Golani by any means, but they were a period where the al-Nusra Front largely faded out of global headlines, as ISIS conducted what became an apocalyptic rampage. Al-Nusra would lose a portion of its fighting forces, particularly a chunk of its foreign members, to the ranks of ISIS, with many of them drawn toward what was seen as even more fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, and a far more immediate set of rewards for those willing to engage in outright plunder. Other members of al-Nusra, alienated by the split, left in favor of other Islamist groups, some of which fizzled out, while others took on a life of their own. Golani was tied to an audio recording that indicated that al-Nusra might have declared its own emirate to rival ISIS, but that never materialized, and al-Nusra was largely expelled from the areas where ISIS was at its strongest, leading to an overall drawdown in direct fighting between the two groups. Al-Nusra would make headlines a few more times during the peak of ISIS activities, including when they kidnapped 45 UN peacekeepers and pinned down dozens more under heavy fire in a rather poorly thought-out attempt to get themselves removed from the UN's list of terrorist organizations. In the coming years, their reputation around the world certainly didn't get much better. But it was around this time, starting in about 2015, when close observers began to spot a bit of daylight between Abu Mohammed al Golani's al-Nusra Front and the other jihadist insurgencies of the Middle East. One of the clearest early signals of the change came during an interview with the media organization Al Jazeera in that same year. During that interview, with his face concealed from the camera, Golani explained that his organization was focused singularly on targeting adversaries inside Syria, the Assad regime, the Iran-backed organization Hezbollah, and their rivals in the Islamic State. Quoting Golani directly here, Nusra Front doesn't have any plans or directives to target the West. Maybe al-Qaeda does that, but not here in Syria. In that same interview, Golani expressed a lack of interest in retaliation against Syria's Alawite minority. Outside that single interview, Golani and his inner circle dropped a handful of other hints during this time to suggest that regardless of al-Qaeda's focus on attacks against the West, al-Nusra's priority was Syria, plain and simple. Now, that's not to say that al-Nusra suddenly moderated during this time, indeed far from it. This was barely a year after Golani himself had threatened war with the United States and with any group in Syria that accepted money or support from the United States in what had been an expression of support for his rivals in ISIS as they weathered the opening few salvos of the US-led air campaign against them. Not long after his interview, Golani would call for attacks against Russians and against Alawite stronghold areas to retaliate for Russia's air campaign, and he'd offer million-dollar bounties for Bashar al-Assad and the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. That year, al-Nusra fighters carried out a massacre against Syrian villagers of the Druze minority and beheaded fighters allied to a multi-ethnic Kurdish-led resistance organization. In addition to their terrorist designations across most of the Western world, they picked up the same inauspicious title from Russia. All told, this was not an organization that had suddenly seen the light, and Abu Mohammed al Golani was not some born-again rebel who decided to swear off his old ways. But behind the violence and the rhetoric, there was movement, and after a few global analysis groups offered early indication that a split among the jihadists might be coming, those rumors grew and grew. In early 2015, al-Nusra was reported to have opened a dialogue with Qatar and the other states of the Persian Gulf who had allegedly pushed Golani to sever ties with al-Qaeda in exchange for future funding. Sources from inside the jihadist world indicated that al-Nusra might absorb a bunch of smaller insurgencies and go off on their own, while some of their fighters and non-combat affiliates suggested that many of the group's fighters had no appetite for worldwide jihad operations. Turkey and Saudi Arabia were reported to be in on the effort, backing a rival organization while dangling the carrots that they'd support al-Nusra if Golani would just disassociate from al-Qaeda internationally. Finally, in mid-2016, after a rapid swell in the ranks to between 5,000 and 10,000 fighters, al-Nusra confirmed that those long-muttered rumors had been grounded in truth. The organization, still headed by Al Golani, announced its official split from al-Qaeda and declared itself to be, quote, completely independent. That means we don't report to anyone, we don't receive directives from any external enemy. To represent their new status, the group temporarily adopted the moniker of Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, the fronts for the conquest of Syria. 6 months later, after a period of infighting, mergers, local conquests in the Syrian north and more, the group would rebrand for a final time. When they did, they joined together with a range of other jihadist groups under Abu Mohammed al Golani's ultimate authority. The new name they chose for their collective was one that we would recognize today, the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, better known today as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The choice of Al Golani and his allies to rebrand into the HTS organization was broadly shrugged off by the rest of the world as a simple attempt to yet again rebrand what was fundamentally a violent jihadist insurgency. The world had already watched Golani move between the names of various organizations, invent new titles and monikers for his own group, and revert to the same tactics of terrorist resistance time and time again. This time, his new HTS group was technically led by another known jihadi known as Abu Jaber, but it was still Golani leading its military operations, and when Jaber stepped down in late 2017, it was Golani leading the entire thing. For all intents and purposes, very little had changed, or at least not in the situation observed by Western onlookers. In truth, the formation of HTS wasn't exactly a rebirth for Golani's organization, but it was a good deal more meaningful than most of the Western world had realized. By that time, after all their various mergers, the group was thought to have anywhere from 20 to 40,000 fighters in its ranks, with a power base in the north of Syria centered on the governorate of Idlib. They were well established in that area, with reason to believe that even if Russian and Syrian air power could strike them at will, it was unlikely that the forces of Damascus would be able to march on them anytime soon. And over the course of their first year in business, 2017, they set to work consolidating their control over Idlib. Amidst skirmishes with other rebel groups on their territory, HTS took part in offensives against Syria in other parts of the country. They also turned their attention towards cells of ISIS operatives on their territory, and even representatives of al-Qaeda and its remaining Syrian affiliates. They too faced the wrath of Golani's fighters, who transformed themselves into northwest Syria's dominant influence by the end of 2017. They weathered hardship in the process, including a wave of assassinations of high-ranking HTS officials, but Golani survived that storm and capitalized on the opportunity to move HTS further away from al-Qaeda ideology while building up a new civilian-led local administration in Idlib. By the start of 2019, after a victory in a minor conflict with Turkish-backed rebels, HTS gained control over practically the entirety of Idlib. It was at this point that the situation between Golani's forces and the forces of the Syrian government settled into the posture that they'd maintain all the way through late 2024. Upon consolidating control over Idlib, Golani surged his troops forward into a demilitarized zone and worked to push back Syrian armed forces, to which Damascus responded by dramatically increasing its own troop numbers in the area. Staring each other down across a narrow divide, HTS and the Syrian government would each launch occasional offensives to probe toward each other, but neither was able to yield results that would justify a broader military push against the other's weak spots. Around the same time, the group established a quiet but consistent relationship with Turkish leadership in Ankara and built an increasingly robust civil authority, the Syrian Salvation Government, to manage the population centers they held. As the 2010s wore on to the 2020s, Golani himself began to step out of the shadows where he'd grown so comfortable. As the leader of both HTS and the Syrian Salvation Government, as Emir, Golani's public presence in Idlib became a matter of civil importance. Like other non-state entities that have gained control over a chunk of populated land, Golani and his associates set about crafting both a coherent approach to things like infrastructure, local health and education, and taxation, and a simultaneous media push to appeal to the people now living under his control. Before long, HTS media was churning out regular items promoting the Syrian Salvation Government, depicting the work of social welfare programs for rural and poor communities, and documenting Golani's personal efforts to keep the peace, aid in reconstruction, and build alliances with local militias. As it turned out, Golani proved to be just as good at leading a civil administration as he was at coordinating a terrorist insurgency. In the years that Idlib had been under Golani's mostly autonomous control, it's gone through a bit of a renaissance, springing up from its past situation as the poorest governorate in Syria and developing everything from regional commerce to robust water and electrical infrastructure to luxury shopping malls. The governorate ran a thriving education system, including a total of 12 universities. It ran a reasonably competent but very resource-limited response to the local outbreak of COVID-19, and it built a trade arrangement with Kurdish Rojava, another autonomous administration that was broadly adversarial to the Assad regime. The Syrian Salvation Government created and launched a service called Syria Phone, providing 4G, SMS, video calls, and more to the province, while as recently as 2024, the country's newest prime minister began an initiative to overhaul and transform the administration so that it could rely on modern digital technologies. To offset reliance on the Turkish lira and get around international sanctions, HTS has encouraged the use of cryptocurrency across its territory, while in order to ensure that it can remain agriculturally self-sufficient, it's built seed testing and distribution infrastructure to aid farmers with cultivation. They returned land occupied by foreign jihadists to their Syrian owners, including Christians and Druze, and allowed gatherings by Christians and non-Sunni Muslims. The Syrian Salvation Government even ran a version of the Paralympic Games in August of 2024, despite intense outcry from hardliners in Idlib. And that's not to say that Golani's tenure as emir in Idlib has always gone well. Far from it. He and his civil administration have faced repeated protests by the population of Idlib as punishment for a variety of offences, some of them similar to that of any other regional government, and some of them a particularly meat-headed variety that made it clear that these were leaders who'd very recently traded in their assault rifles for civilian gear. On the more typical side, Golani dealt with protests against harsh taxation policies and the after-effects of reliance on the Turkish lira, a currency that quickly depreciated at times during HTS's governance. The Syrian pound was outlawed in Idlib quickly once HTS took over. Some of the group's attempts at implementing fundamentalist laws, like forcing women to travel with a male family member or wear the niqab or allowing corporal punishment within the justice system, were shot down by local protesters rather quickly. That was despite Golani's personal endorsement of things like, quote, chopping off hands, stoning whomever, whipping someone who drinks alcohol, which Golani himself described in 2020 as, quote, a very basic part of the very big concept of implementing the rule of the Sharia. Other measures, like gender segregation in schools, have been instituted, although HTS has made more and more allowances for various types of religious institutes, so long as they remain politically neutral. In the more extreme cases of bad governance by HTS, the group's leaders did things like bombing a town when its residents refused to pay a tax on olive oil, sabotaged its efforts to suspend mosque services during COVID, and in a particularly concerning trend, conducted mass surveillance and frequent detention of people who were regarded as dissidents for having spoken out against HTS rule. It would take years for HTS and Golani to start releasing non-violent offenders it had swept up, somewhat pushing back against that authoritarian tendency, but never really getting rid of it. In 2024, Golani admitted to HTS's use of torture against prisoners to extract false confessions and acknowledged occasional retributive attacks by HTS fighters against religious and cultural minority groups under his administration. In early 2024, Golani would weather a direct challenge to his rule amidst widespread protests in Idlib that called for his personal ouster as emir. The protesters' grievances were wide-ranging, including everything from repression by HTS forces to the imprisonment of thousands of critics of his administration and economic pressures all up and down Idlib society. Whether those protests were an eye-opening moment for Golani or whether they simply constituted too big a threat to ignore, that's up for debate, but his response to the protests was telling nonetheless. Faced with a situation in which leaders of an al-Qaeda-adjacent persuasion, let alone an Islamic State interpretation of what it means to be a civil leader, might have responded with massacre and inquisition, Golani instead made major concessions to the protest movement. That included the mass release of prisoners, the start of local elections, and a number of economic reforms to help the people of the province. He even developed an official Department of Grievances for people to lodge complaints, although skeptics insisted that the department and Golani's other actions were just for show. Yet underlying Golani's motivations in working with the protest movement may have been a second and more pragmatic reality. By early 2024, Golani was just inches away from enacting a plan that he and his inner circle had been working on, we now know, for years. And rather than let himself be brought down by some local protests, Golani may have chosen to play the long game in advance of what came next. By 2024, Syria's civil war had stretched into its 14th year, but it had taken the shape of a mostly frozen conflict for the prior half-decade. The Islamic State no longer held meaningful territory, the Kurds of Rojava were no longer interested in claiming territory, the resistance movements of the country's heartland and south lacked any real coordination, and Turkish-backed forces in the far northwest were more focused on the Kurds than they were with Assad. The regime, with Russian and Iranian backing, was thought to be strong enough to defend itself on the territory it held, but it was neither able nor particularly willing to launch an offensive to wipe out any of its rivals around the nation. Instead, Syria was in a holding pattern that looked as if it might last another decade or more, but behind the scenes, Abu Mohammed al Golani and his allies were hard at work preparing to change the game. We now know, in hindsight, that the effort to prepare an HTS offensive began in early 2022, if not sooner. Since 2020, HTS has been in the process of shifting its forces to a more conventional military posture rather than an asymmetric insurgency, and they'd allegedly begun to accept training support from Ukraine. HTS fighters ran frequent probing attacks against the regime forces, hemming them in, sometimes with snipers, sometimes via drone or personal reconnaissance, sometimes via little skirmishes here and there. HTS built the infrastructure to construct and arm various types of drones, including some for reconnaissance and some for kamikaze attacks, while the group's highest leaders quietly made connections with other anti-regime groups in the area and got their support for an eventual offensive. On the ground level, HTS selected and trained soldiers for special commando units, including highly specialized nighttime brigades that received the best weaponry that the group could offer. Golani and his close allies watched first Russia and then Iran run into trouble on the global stage, slowly pulling more and more troops out of Syria until it seemed as if the Assad regime had little of the tangible support it had relied upon for years. The offensive began on the 27th of November 2024 under the name Operation Deterrence of Aggression. Nominally, it was an attempt to destroy Syrian army positions from which regime forces had launched artillery shells into Idlib and indiscriminate attacks that killed civilians. The true target, however, appeared to be Aleppo, Syria's largest city not far from Idlib. Cutting in from all directions, leveraging their drones, their shock troops, and their night brigades, HTS had stunning success against the forces of the regime, and in fact, they had better success than even they seemed to anticipate. Within just a few days, and with none of the attritional fighting that HTS had anticipated from the Russia-advised regime, Aleppo had fallen, and the rest is history. HTS seized the momentum, crashed southward to the city of Hama, then to the city of Homs, and within less than 2 weeks, Bashar al-Assad was on a plane to Moscow as the forces of the Syrian Arab Republic laid down their arms. As the leader of HTS and the new face of the Syrian liberation from Assad, Abu Mohammed al Golani took center stage in a way that the Golani of, say, 2006 or even 2013 couldn't have possibly imagined. After his long personal and organizational pivot away from the jihadist terror tactics of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, it should perhaps be unsurprising that Golani chose to frame himself not as a bloodthirsty militant, but as a legitimate, peaceful, even tolerant alternative to the Syrian regime. But for Western analysts who'd missed out on many of the intricacies of Golani's leadership in Idlib, it was a shock to see him return to the global spotlight in the way that he did. Wearing military fatigues and Western-style suits with no head covering, sitting down for thoughtful interviews with foreign press, and emphasizing his record as the leader of a civil government in Idlib, he was a far cry from the young man who had led a gang of 7 die-hard fundamentalists to start the al-Nusra front. He even left his long-time moniker behind, trading in Abu Mohammed al Golani for his birth name, and the name that we'll return to calling him for the remainder of this episode, Ahmed al-Sharaa. Today, In the immediate aftermath of the fall of the regime, al-Sharaa still presides over an organization that the UN, the US, Russia, the European Union, and other world nations classify as a terrorist group. When he took command after the fall of Assad, he still had a $10 million bounty on his head from the United States. But you'd hardly know the full extent of his past activities as a terrorist leader by watching him now. Al-Sharaa has called forcefully for the protection of Syria's Alawite population, a group that's long feared violent retribution if their protector, Bashar al-Assad, was ever ousted. He's emphasized HTS's commitment to the protection of minorities, from Christians to Druze to Kurds and more, and he's vowed not to attack Russia's military assets in Syria so long as the Russians don't launch attacks themselves. When Israel surged troops onto Syrian territory in what's now described as an indefinite occupation, he declined the opportunity to demagogue Israeli leaders or their troops, instead committing to the idea that Syria's new leaders aren't looking to reopen hostilities with anybody right now. Al-Sharaa has taken a pragmatic tone when dealing with HTS's terror classifications abroad, advocating for the construction of third-party Syrian aid organizations that can work with humanitarian groups without the sorts of HTS involvement that would prohibit foreign organizations from collaborating. He's emphasized the need to rehabilitate and reform the Syrian government rather than destroy it, and he's issued broad amnesty to most members of the Syrian regime while vowing to prosecute those involved with Syria's long-running systems of forced disappearance, torture, mass imprisonment, and extrajudicial execution. So as we conclude today's episode, we should be abundantly clear about what our closing message is and what it is not. For our part at WarFronts, we don't advocate a reckless embrace of either Ahmed al-Sharaa as Syria's de facto leader, or either HTS or its civil administration as Syria's new overseers. We certainly don't endorse his past actions, and we don't endorse him now. What we do wish to emphasize, however, is that now that Ahmed al-Sharaa is the man at the helm of Syria's future, it is vital to understand his history, his motivations, his evolution through time, and the range of options that he likely believes are laid out ahead of him now. Whether or not he's genuine in his transformation has been a matter of considerable debate after the fall of Assad. But far more important than the genuineness of his personal convictions is the impact that he's going to have on Syria, one way or the other. In a decade's time, in 2 decades, 3, we'll be able to look back at this moment with the benefit of hindsight and know exactly who and what Ahmed al-Sharaa was in the final days of 2024. Perhaps he will be viewed as a tyrant, a man who got control of a nation and turned it into a caliphate. Perhaps he'll be viewed as a puppet, taking control only to hand true authority over to Turkey or Russia or America or somebody else. Perhaps he'll be viewed as a liberator, a hero, a lion, on par with some of the most transformative figures across history. Probably the truth will be a good deal more messy and more complicated than any of those simple visions of the future would suggest. The point is, we won't know till we get there. And in a world where we should all be watching Syria closely in this difficult moment, we're better if we understand who we're looking at when we look at Ahmed al-Sharaa. The man said it himself in a CNN interview after he and his forces toppled Assad, to quote, "Don't judge by words, but by actions." In the coming months and years, we're going to do exactly that. So let's hope al-Sharaa can live up to the things that he has promised. Thank you for watching.